Alaska's deep wilderness hides a horrifying Sasquatch secret. A veteran pilot thought this was just another contract flight, dropping 2 researchers into a remote valley cut off from the world. But within days, they weren't studying caribou anymore. They were finding massive tracks in the river mud, strange lattice structures woven from saplings, and wood knocks echoing through the trees at night. The deeper they went, the more it felt like something was watching and waiting. When storms trapped them, the evidence turned personal. A handprint the size of a dinner plate smeared across their supply crate. They made it out alive, but the question still haunts them, and it will haunt you too. What exactly is lurking in Alaska's untouched forests, and why does it seem determined to keep people out? Let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. If you like stories that connect us, don't forget to subscribe before you leave. My name is Mark Ellison, and after 27 years of flying bush planes across Alaska's backcountry, I've developed a pretty good sense for when something isn't right. The events I'm about to share took place during the summer of 2022, while I was working a contract ferrying research teams into the Tongass National Forest. Looking back now, I wish I'd trusted that initial unease a bit more. I've spent most of my career running a small aviation service out of Juneau, mainly handling supply runs, emergency medical transport, and the occasional tourist group. It's not glamorous work, but it keeps me in the air and pays the bills. When Dr. Helena Chun's research team approached me about a 3-month contract to support their field surveys, it seemed like straightforward work, the kind of job I could do in my sleep. The agreement was simple enough. I'd fly their 4-person team into a series of remote sites across the southeastern peninsula, wait on standby at designated pickup points, and extract them when their surveys were complete. Good money for relatively easy flying, at least on paper. They even offered a premium for my experience with difficult terrain landings, which should have been my first clue that this wasn't going to be a typical summer contract. I remember going through the pre-flight checklist on that first morning in early June, watching the research team load their equipment into my de Havilland Beaver. The sun hadn't fully crested the mountains yet, and there was still a heavy morning fog clinging to the runway. Dr. Chun was reviewing coordinates with her assistant, while the other 2 team members, whose names I'd later learn were Marcus and Sarah, secured their sampling gear in the cargo hold. My Beaver isn't exactly new. She's a 1976 model that I've maintained religiously for the past 15 years, but she's reliable in the kind of conditions where reliability means the difference between life and death. I just finished the annual inspection 2 weeks prior, replacing the voltage regulator and giving her a fresh set of tires. Some pilots name their planes. I never saw the point. She's a tool, not a pet, and getting sentimental about machinery is a good way to make bad decisions when the weather turns. The morning's weather report showed clear conditions over our primary survey area, with some potential afternoon thunderstorms building up from the coast. Nothing unusual for early summer in southeast Alaska, but I made a mental note to keep an eye on the cloud formation. Weather changes fast up here, and being caught in a mountain valley during a summer storm is nobody's idea of a good time. Everything secure back there? I called out to the team as they finished loading. Dr. Chun gave me a thumbs up, her expression serious behind wire-rimmed glasses. She struck me as the methodical type, the kind who triple-checks everything and leaves nothing to chance. That's the sort of person you want to work with in remote locations. I did one final walk-around inspection of the aircraft, checking control surfaces and making sure the fuel caps were properly secured. The pre-flight ritual is something that becomes almost meditative after a few decades, but I never rush it. Too many pilots have died from assuming everything was fine without checking. The engine started smooth, all 6 cylinders catching immediately. As we taxied toward the runway, I noticed Dr. Chun writing something in a small notebook. The others were quiet, probably running through their own mental checklists for the day ahead. None of us knew then how different things would look by the end of that summer. I keyed the radio, getting clearance for takeoff. The fog was starting to burn off, revealing patches of blue sky above. The Beaver lifted easily into the morning air, her engine humming that familiar steady rhythm that's been the soundtrack to most of my adult life. Banking east toward the first survey site, I watched the city disappear behind us as we headed into the vast green expanse of the Tongasses. Looking back, I keep asking myself if there were signs, some warning I should have seen in those early hours. But the truth is, everything seemed completely normal. Just another summer contract in the Alaskan wilderness. At least, that's what I thought at the time. The first team I'd be working with consisted of 2 biologists, Claire Rudd and Victor Hawley. They were scheduled for a 3-week survey in the northeastern section of the forest, focusing on caribou migration patterns and the spread of invasive plant species. I watched them methodically organizing their gear while we waited for the morning fog to clear completely. Claire Rudd was clearly the senior researcher, probably in her mid-40s, with the kind of efficient movements you develop after years of fieldwork. She was carefully checking a set of trail cameras, making sure each battery pack was fully charged and the memory cards were empty. A stack of waterproof notebooks and several GPS units were laid out on a folding table beside her, along with what looked like dozens of small sample vials. "We'll need to set up monitoring stations at 5 different elevations," she explained, showing me the coordinates on a topographical map. "The caribou herds have been shifting their routes over the past 3 years, and we need to understand if it's related to changes in the plant communities." Her tone was precise, clinical, the voice of someone who'd spent their career turning wilderness into data points. Victor Hawley, her assistant, was younger, maybe early 30s, and seemed more focused on the physical aspects of their upcoming work. He was testing his handheld camcorder and adjusting the straps on a heavy-duty backpack filled with collection equipment. I noticed his hands were already marked with the kind of calluses you get from regular field work. "We've got permits for tissue sampling if we find evidence of the invasive species we're tracking," Victor mentioned, showing me a folder of official documentation, plus authorization for temporary research structures at each monitoring site. He was carefully checking his binoculars, a high-end pair that probably cost more than a month's salary. Their preparation was impressive, everything labeled, redundant systems in place, emergency protocols clearly established. They had satellite phones, emergency beacons, and enough supplies to last well beyond their planned stay if something went wrong. It was the kind of professional thoroughness that made my job easier. The university's particularly interested in any correlation between the invasive species spread and changes in large mammal behavior, Claire explained while calibrating what looked like some kind of soil testing equipment. "We've got motion-triggered cameras to monitor wildlife patterns, but we'll also be collecting plant samples and soil cores from each site." I appreciated their clarity of purpose. Too often, I'd worked with researchers who had vague objectives or unrealistic expectations about what could be accomplished in the backcountry. Claire and Victor knew exactly what they needed: specific locations, precise time windows, and clear data collection protocols. As they finished their preparations, I could see why the university had selected them for this project. They moved with the quiet confidence of people who understood both the scientific requirements of their work and the practical challenges of conducting research in remote wilderness. It was exactly the kind of professional competence you want to see when you're flying people into isolated territory. The morning fog was starting to lift as I completed my pre-flight checks on the de Havilland Beaver. I'd flown this particular aircraft for over 8 years now, and its familiar quirks were as readable to me as a well-worn book. Claire and Victor worked with quiet efficiency, securing their equipment in the cargo hold, the kind of methodical organization you'd expect from career scientists. "How much of this gear is yours, Claire?" I asked, noting the careful way she handled what looked like sensitive monitoring equipment. "The tracking collars and radio telemetry equipment are mine," she replied, adjusting her wire-rimmed glasses. "I'm focusing on the caribou movement patterns through the valley systems. Victor's got most of the botanical sampling gear." Victor, a tall man with graying temples and weathered hands, nodded as he secured his own containers. "Mostly specimen collection equipment and survey tools. We're tracking 3 particularly aggressive invasive species that have been making their way up from the south." Once everything was properly stored and weighted, we took off from Fairbanks International Airport just as the sun was breaking through the morning haze. The transition from civilization to wilderness was dramatic and swift. Within 30 minutes, we'd left behind all signs of human development, trading roads and buildings for the vast expanse of the Alaskan interior, the Koyukuk region. Spread out below us like an enormous patchwork quilt, dark green spruce forests interwoven with the silver threads of braided rivers and the golden brown expanses of tundra. From 5,000 feet up, you could really appreciate the sheer scale of the isolation. No roads penetrated this far. No cell towers broke the horizon, just wilderness in every direction. "There's the convergence point we discussed," I said, pointing out the meeting of 2 river systems below. The water channels split and rejoined like tangled ribbons across the valley floor. "That's where you mentioned seeing the highest concentration of caribou activity in the satellite data, right?" Claire leaned forward in her seat, her notebook already out. "Exactly. The thermal imaging suggested significant movement through these corridors during the early summer migration. We're hoping to get a better understanding of why they're choosing these specific routes." The further north we flew, the more the landscape seemed to swallow us whole. The GPS coordinates for their base camp location led us deeper into a region where even the emergency radio frequencies grew spotty. I'd flown these routes countless times, but there was always something sobering about watching the last hints of civilization fade away completely. "No signal," Victor commented, glancing at his satellite phone. "Exactly what we expected for this region. The emergency beacon will still work if you need it," I assured them. Though in 23 years of flying these routes, I'd only had to use one twice. "And I'll be checking in on schedule every 5 days for supply runs and data collection." But isolation wasn't just a physical reality out here. It was a presence you could feel, as tangible as the aircraft's vibrations beneath our feet. Below us, the untouched wilderness stretched to every horizon, holding whatever secrets it had kept for millennia. The late June sun barely set this far north, giving us nearly 24 hours of workable daylight. After touching down on a relatively flat stretch beside the Koyukuk River, we quickly established our base camp on a raised gravel bar. The location was perfect, elevated enough to stay dry if the river rose, but with easy access to both the water and the dense spruce forest. Beyond Claire and Victor fell into an efficient routine almost immediately. Claire would head out at dawn with her telemetry equipment, tracking the caribou herds that moved through the valleys, while Victor focused on cataloging plant species and collecting specimens closer to camp. I maintained radio contact and kept the camp running, though the satellite phone only worked sporadically this far out. On our 3rd morning, I was doing maintenance checks on the beaver when Victor returned early from his morning survey, looking slightly puzzled. He'd been working his way along the riverbank, documenting the spread of an invasive sedge species. "Mark, could you take a look at something?" he called out, waving me over to where he stood at the edge of our camp. I set down my tools and walked over, noting how he kept glancing back at whatever had caught his attention. "What have you got?" I asked, following his gaze to the muddy riverbank about 30 feet from our tents. "I'm not entirely sure," Victor said, crouching down beside a series of depressions in the mud. "At first, I thought they were moose tracks, but the pattern isn't right. And look at the depth. Whatever made these was heavy." I knelt beside him, studying the marks. They were roughly oval-shaped depressions, maybe 15 inches long, pressed deep into the riverside mud. The spacing between them was odd, wider than you'd expect from most large animals in the area. Could be erosion, I suggested, though something about the regularity of the depressions made me doubt it. The river levels dropped about 6 inches since we arrived. Sometimes that creates strange patterns in the mud. Victor nodded, but I could tell he wasn't convinced. He pulled out his field notebook and started sketching the depressions, measuring them with a small ruler he carried for plant specimens. "I'll show these to Claire when she gets back," he said, still focused on his careful documentation. "Maybe. She's seen something similar while tracking the caribou." I watched him work for a few minutes, appreciating his methodical approach, even to something that was probably nothing more than natural erosion patterns. Still, I found myself glancing back at those depressions several times throughout the day as I worked on the plane. Something about their deliberate-looking placement nagging at the edge of my thoughts. When Claire returned that evening, Victor showed her his sketches, but she seemed more interested in sharing her own findings about the caribou movements through the valley. The depressions in the mud were quickly forgotten as we focused on preparing dinner and planning the next day's survey routes. As night settled in, I sat in my tent with my small tape recorder, a habit I'd developed over years of solo flights and remote camps. The endless summer daylight had finally given way to a dim twilight around 11 p.m., though it wouldn't get truly dark for another hour or so. June 23rd, 2022. Koyukuk Base Camp, Day 3, I spoke quietly into the recorder. Weather holding steady. Barometer shows steady pressure, though clouds moving in from the northwest suggest possible changes by morning. A gust of wind rustled through the spruce trees surrounding our camp, and then nothing. The silence that followed was absolute, catching me off guard. In all my years flying the Alaskan bush, I'd learned that nature is never truly quiet. There's always something. Birds settling for the night, small animals moving through underbrush, insects buzzing. But in that moment, everything just stopped. I clicked off the recorder and listened intently. The wind died down completely, leaving an unnatural stillness that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. 30 seconds passed, maybe a minute. Then, carried on the still air, I heard it. A single hollow knock, like someone striking a dead tree with a baseball bat. The sound echoed across the valley, clear and deliberate. Knock. I pressed record again, hoping to capture it if it repeated. The sound had come from the direction of the dense spruce forest, maybe a quarter-mile from camp. I waited, straining to hear through the returning whisper of wind in the trees. A shadow passed by my tent, and I heard the crunch of gravel. Claire, making her way to the camp latrine we'd set up. When she returned, I called out softly, "Claire, got a minute?" She unzipped my tent flap and poked her head in. "Everything okay, Mark? Did you hear that knock a few minutes ago? Oh, that?" She shrugged, "Probably just branches hitting each other in the wind. We've got a lot of dead spruce out there, beetle kill from a few years back. They make all sorts of noises when the wind picks up." I nodded, not wanting to seem paranoid, but something about that sound hadn't felt random. It was too isolated, too precise. "Yeah, you're probably right," I said. Just caught me off guard with how quiet everything got beforehand. Claire gave me a tired smile. "The wind does funny things in these valleys. Get some sleep, we've got an early start tomorrow." After she left, I picked up my recorder again. Additional note, single knock heard at approximately 20:15 hours. Clear, wooden sound, notable silence preceded it. Claire suggests wind-blown branches, but sound was isolated, not repeated. We'll monitor for similar occurrences. I tucked the recorder away and tried to settle in for the night, but found myself listening intently to every whisper of wind, waiting for that hollow knock to repeat. It didn't come again, but the memory of that perfect silence beforehand stayed with me. The next few days settled into a rhythm of early mornings and long hours in the field. Claire and Victor would head out at first light, GPS units and specimen containers in hand, while I maintained our base camp and checked the plane. But something felt off about our little patch of wilderness, like the forest itself was holding its breath. On our fourth morning, I joined Claire on her survey route, helping carry equipment through a dense stand of black spruce. About 2 miles from camp, she stopped abruptly, pointing to a massive tree trunk. "Mark, what do you make of that?" The gouges in the bark caught my eye immediately. 4 parallel grooves that started at least 9 feet up the trunk and ran almost to the ground. In 30 years of bush flying, I'd seen plenty of bear markings, but these were different. Too high, too uniform, and far too deep. "Bears don't reach that height," I said, pulling out my phone to take photos. "Not even standing up." Claire ran, her fingers along the lowest part of the marks. "These are fresh. The sap hasn't even dried completely." That afternoon, Victor returned from his western survey route looking troubled. He'd found similar markings on 3 different trees, all facing the river. As we discussed it over dinner, a peculiar musky odor drifted through our camp. It wasn't the typical wilderness smell of decay and vegetation. This was sharper, almost like wet fur mixed with something else I couldn't place. The scent would come and go with the wind, never staying long enough to track its source. The following day, I noticed something that made the hair on my neck stand up. During my pre-flight check of the plane, I found clear impressions in the mud near the pontoons, massive, human-like footprints that hadn't been there the evening before. They measured nearly 16 inches long, with 5 distinct toe marks. I photographed them carefully, placing my own size 11 boot next to them for scale. But it was during our survey treks that the sensation became unmistakable. We were being watched. You develop a sixth sense for this kind of thing after decades in the bush. It's not paranoia, it's instinct. The feeling would come suddenly, like a pressure change before a storm. The birds would go quiet, the wind would die, and you'd know. Something was there, just beyond your field of vision. Victor felt it too. "It's like being stalked," he admitted one evening, his voice low despite our isolation. "But not by anything I've encountered before. Whatever's watching us, it's smart enough to stay hidden." Claire remained skeptical, focused on her data collection. But I noticed she'd started keeping her bear spray closer at hand and no longer ventured far from camp alone. The gouges in the trees, the footprints, the musky scent, each could be explained away individually perhaps. But together, they painted a picture that grew more unsettling with each passing day. I was reviewing the day's footage from our trail cameras when something caught my eye. The timestamp showed 7:43 p.m., just after sunset when the light was getting thin. At first, I almost scrolled past it, used to cataloging endless frames of swaying branches and startled hares. But then I noticed the sequence, 3 frames taken in rapid succession. Something large moved through the clearing we'd been monitoring for caribou activity. The first frame showed just a dark blur against the tree line. The second, my hand actually trembled as I zoomed in, captured what appeared to be an upright figure crossing between 2 spruce trees. The third frame was empty again, just the dim clearing. "Claire," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "You need to see this." She came over from her makeshift desk of field notebooks and specimen containers, peering at my laptop screen with her usual clinical detachment. I cycled through the frames again. The timing suggests it's moving incredibly fast for its size. She noted, reaching for her own notebook. "What's the scale reference on that clearing?" "Those spruce trees are about 15 feet apart," I replied. Whatever it is cleared that distance in under a second. Victor had wandered over too, and I noticed his face had gone pale as he studied the images. The figure was frustratingly blurry, the camera's infrared flash creating more questions than answers, but the height was undeniable. Using the trees as reference, it had to be at least 7 or 8 feet tall. Could be a bear standing up, Claire suggested, but her voice lacked conviction. We'd all seen plenty of bears in our weeks. Here, this movement pattern was different, more fluid, more purposeful. Bears don't move like that, Victor said quietly. He'd been growing increasingly tense over the past few days, and now I could see his hands shaking slightly as he gripped the back of my chair. And bears don't. They don't watch you like we're being watched. Claire shot him a sharp look. What? Do you mean? You haven't felt it? Victor's voice was barely above a whisper. When we're out collecting samples? Like there's always something just behind the trees, moving when we move, stopping when we stop. Following but staying just out of sight. I had to admit, I'd had similar sensations during my own survey work, that prickling feeling of eyes on my back. The way sounds would sometimes stop abruptly, leaving unnatural pockets of silence in the forest. Claire was already typing notes, categorizing the images with her usual methodical precision. We need to be careful about jumping to conclusions, she said firmly. There are plenty of natural explanations for large wildlife movements. We'll set up additional cameras tomorrow, try to get clearer images. But I noticed she was writing in a separate notebook from her official field journal, one I hadn't seen before. And her hands weren't quite as steady as they usually were. Victor just stared at the screen, at that blurred upright shape moving with impossible speed through our quiet clearing. I don't think I want to know what kind of images we'll get, he said softly. I needed to check our western sensor array about 2 miles from base camp. The morning was crisp, my breath visible in the autumn air as I shouldered my pack with fresh batteries and memory cards. Claire was busy cataloging specimens, so I headed out alone, something we'd done dozens of times before without incident. The first mile went smoothly enough. I followed our flagged route through the spruce forest, marking waypoints on my GPS and checking for any camera damage from recent winds. The timber was thick here, branches interlacing overhead to create a perpetual twilight even at mid-morning. That's when I first noticed the footsteps. At first, I tried to convince myself it was just my own boots echoing off the trees. But this sound wasn't quite right. It was slightly out of sync with my stride, coming from somewhere behind me and to my left. I stopped abruptly, and after a brief delay, the other footsteps ceased too. My heart began to pound. I forced myself to breathe slowly, straining to listen over the soft whisper of wind through the spruce needles. Nothing. Just as I started walking again, the footsteps resumed. They weren't random animal movements. Whatever was back there was matching my pace, keeping a consistent distance. When I sped up, it sped up. When I slowed, it slowed. Each time I stopped, it would stop a second or two later, as if trying to maintain the illusion of an echo. I abandoned my planned route and turned back toward camp, no longer even pretending to check the cameras. The footsteps continued there. Parallel course, sometimes drawing slightly closer before falling back again. Through gaps in the trees, I caught glimpses of movement, just shadow and suggestion, but enough to confirm something large was pacing me through the timber. By the time I made it back to camp, I was nearly running. Claire looked up from her work table as I burst into the clearing, face flushed and hands shaking. Victor, what's wrong? Something followed me, I said, dropping my pack and slumping onto a camp stool. The whole way back, something big. A bear? She asked, but I shook my head. Bears don't stalk like that. This was deliberate, intelligent. It knew exactly what it was doing, keeping pace, stopping when I stopped, testing me. I described the experience in detail as Claire took notes, her skepticism gradually giving way to concern. Did you see it clearly? She asked. No, just movement through the trees. But Claire, nothing in these woods moves like that. Nothing we've documented. Anyway, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd been evaluated, sized up. Whatever it was, it wanted me to know it was there. The rest of that day, I couldn't focus on my work. My eyes kept drifting to the tree line where I'd emerged, half expecting to see something watching us from the shadows. The incident had shaken my scientific detachment, forcing me to consider possibilities I'd previously dismissed. I was checking our weather radio for the third time that morning when Claire's voice crackled through on our handheld. "Mark, you need to see this." Something in her tone made me grab my gear without hesitation. I found her about 200 yards from camp, standing motionless at the edge of a small clearing. She pointed wordlessly at what had caught her attention, and I felt my throat tighten. A dozen or more saplings had been woven together in an intricate lattice pattern, forming an arch roughly 8 feet high. The young trees weren't broken or splintered. They'd been carefully bent and intertwined while still living, their leaves still green and vital. "This isn't natural," Claire said, her scientific detachment wavering slightly. She was already photographing the structure from multiple angles, measuring its dimensions with a laser rangefinder. "The pattern is too precise. Look at how these crosspoints are secured. It's like someone braided them together." "Could be storm damage," I offered, not believing it myself. We'd had strong winds 2 nights ago, but nothing that could explain this level of complexity. The construction showed clear intent, with smaller branches woven through the larger ones to reinforce the structure. "Storm damage doesn't create symmetrical patterns," Claire countered, making notes in her waterproof journal. "Or consistent spacing between integration points. This is engineered, Mark, but not by any human. We're the only ones out here for at least 50 miles. I keyed my radio. "Victor, you copy? We've got something you should see." Static answered. The weather was deteriorating faster than expected, heavy clouds rolling in from the northwest. My pilot's instincts were screaming at me to get us airborne before the storm hit. But when I checked the wind readings on my portable weather station, I knew we were already too late. Gusts were hitting 35 knots, with ceiling dropping rapidly. "We need to evacuate," I said firmly. "Whatever made this, I don't want to be here when it comes back." Claire was still documenting the structure, her camera clicking rapidly. "We can't leave yet. This could be groundbreaking evidence of tool use and environmental manipulation by an unknown species. I need more time to properly document it." Thunder rolled overhead, and the first heavy drops began to fall. I grabbed Claire's arm. "That storm's going to pin us down for at least 24 hours. We need to get back to camp and secure everything before it hits full force." She reluctantly packed her gear, taking one last series of photos as the sky darkened. We made it back just as the downpour began in earnest. Victor was already in the main tent, looking rattled. When we showed him the photos of the lattice structure, his hands shook slightly. "That's what they do," he whispered. "They mark their territory. We need to leave." But the weather had other plans. Wind howled through the camp, and my satellite phone showed the storm system was massive, stretching for hundreds of miles. We weren't going anywhere until it passed. I thumbed the radio's talk button. "Copy that, Claire. Where are you?" "About 50 yards east of camp, just past the creek bend." "Victor's here too." The sky hung low and threatening, dark clouds rolling in from the northwest. We'd been grounded for 2 days now, the weather system refusing to break. I grabbed my recorder and headed in their direction, my boots squelching through the sodden ground. I found them standing before what looked like modern art gone wrong. A dozen or so saplings, each about wrist thick, had been woven together into an intricate lattice pattern. The trees were bent at unnatural angles, their tops intertwined, to form a crude dome-like structure about 8 feet high. "What do you make of this?" Claire asked, her scientific detachment wavering slightly. Victor circled the structure, taking photos. "This isn't storm damage. Look at how precisely these are woven. And these breaks," he pointed to where the saplings had been snapped. "They're all at similar heights. I clicked on my recorder, narrating what I was seeing. Structure appears deliberately constructed. Saplings bent and broken approximately 8 feet up, woven into. I paused, searching for the right words. What looks like a shelter frame. That night, things got worse. The wind died completely around 9 p.m., leaving us in an unnatural silence broken only by the crackle of our camp stove. That's when the smell hit us, a thick, musky odor that reminded me of wet dog mixed with something else, something earthier and more primitive. Jesus, Victor muttered, pulling his collar over his nose. What is that? I was about to respond when the first knock came, a sharp crack that echoed through the trees. Then another, from a different direction, and another. I fumbled for my recorder, managing to capture the sequence. Knock, 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 pause. Knock dash knock dash knock, the pattern repeated, moving around us in a circle. Claire grabbed her notebook, frantically trying to map the sequence. This isn't random, she whispered. It's coordinated. Like communication. Victor's hand strayed to the bear spray on his belt. Mark, we need to get out of here. Weathers. Still socked in, I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. Visibility's 0-0. We'd never make it off the ground. The knocking continued for almost an hour, sometimes closer, sometimes further away, but always maintaining that same rhythmic pattern. My recorder captured it all, the sounds, our whispered observations, the way the tempo would change as if in response to our movements. When it finally stopped, none of us slept. We huddled around the lantern, jumping at every snapping twig, every rustle in the undergrowth. The smell lingered until dawn, a constant reminder that something was out there, watching, waiting. As first light crept over the horizon, I played back the recording. The knocks were clear, unmistakable. But there was something else in the background, something I hadn't noticed in the moment, a low, rhythmic breathing, almost like chuffing, moving with the knocks. The storm showed no signs of letting up. As our supplies continued to dwindle, I checked our inventory for the third time that day. 4 days of freeze-dried meals remaining, half a propane tank for the camp stove, and barely enough drinking water to last the week. The satellite phone's battery had died 2 days ago, and the solar charger was useless under these leaden skies. We need to set up better perimeter security, I said, watching Claire organize her specimen containers for the 100th time. Her usual scientific precision had given way to nervous repetition. Those wood knocks last night were too close for comfort. Victor nodded, his hands trembling slightly as he threaded wire through a collection of empty tin cans. I've got enough wire for a 30-foot radius around the tents, he said. If anything large comes through, we'll hear it. The makeshift alarm system took us 2 hours to install. We strung the cans at knee height between the spruce trees, creating a crude warning network. Claire suggested positioning them away from the prevailing wind to minimize false alarms. Even in her growing unease, her analytical mind kept working. The fires need to stay high, I insisted, adding more wood to our main campfire. We've got enough dry timber stockpiled for 3 more days, but we'll need to gather more soon. The thought of venturing deeper into the forest made my stomach clench. That pungent, musky odor had become a near-constant presence, especially strong after dusk. It wasn't the rotting vegetation smell of the marsh or the usual forest scents I'd known from 20 years of bush flying. This was something else, something alive and watching. I've never seen anything like this in all my field studies, Claire whispered that evening, huddled close to the fire. Her earlier skepticism had eroded with each passing day. The structured nature of those wood knocks, the way they seemed to answer each other, it suggests communication. Victor hadn't spoken much since his encounter in the timber. He kept his rifle close and jumped at every snapping twig. We should have left at the first sign, he muttered, staring into the darkness. Beyond our firelight, the prints, the structures, we ignored everything until it was too late. I checked my revolver for the 20th time that day, ensuring all 6 chambers were loaded. Our scientific expedition had transformed into a survival situation, and the worst part was knowing something out there was intelligent enough to wait us out. The curiosity that drove these creatures to observe us had taken on a darker edge. As night fell, we huddled in the main tent, listening to the wind and the occasional jingle of our tin can alarms. The fire cast dancing shadows on the tent walls, and that damned smell grew stronger. None of us slept much anymore. We'd gone from researchers to prey, and our dwindling supplies meant we couldn't hold out forever. Something would have to give. The nights had grown longer, darker somehow. We'd strung tin cans around the perimeter of our camp in overlapping rings, creating a crude early warning system. Every evening, I'd watch Claire methodically check each connection, testing the wire's tension while Victor maintained our defensive fires. The flames did little to ward off the crushing weight of being watched. Sleep came in fitful bursts, interrupted by every snap of a twig or whisper of wind. Around 2 a.m., the metallic rattling jolted me awake. Not the gentle tinkling of a breeze. This was sharp, violent. The cans along the western edge of camp clattered against each other like angry wind chimes. "Mark!" Claire's voice cut through the darkness from her tent. "Did you hear that?" "I heard it," I called back, already reaching for my flashlight. Victor emerged from his tent, rifle clutched to his chest. We'd agreed to investigate disturbances as a group. Safety in numbers. The beam of my light caught nothing but swaying branches and dancing shadows. The wire between the cans hung loose, definitely disturbed, but by what? The surrounding forest had fallen into that unnatural silence we'd grown to dread. "Look at the prints," Victor whispered, directing his beam toward the soft earth. The ground was too churned up to make out distinct tracks, but something had definitely moved through here. Something heavy. We maintained our watch until dawn, huddled around the dying embers of our fire. As the first gray light filtered through the canopy, Claire spotted it. Our supply crate had been touched. "Oh my God," she breathed, crouching beside the wooden box. "Mark, Victor, you need to see this. See this." Pressed into the rough wood was a handprint, unmistakably so, but the scale was all wrong. My own hand, when I held it up for comparison, was dwarfed by the impression. The print was nearly twice the size of my palm, with distinct finger marks that appeared to end in slight claw points. It was preserved in perfect detail by some kind of sticky resin, tree sap. Maybe that had been on whatever made it. Victor pulled out his camera, hands shaking as he documented the find. "This isn't possible," he kept muttering. "The largest known primate specimens couldn't." Claire had gone silent, her scientific detachment crumbling as she traced the outline with a trembling finger. "The dermal ridges," she said finally. "You can see them clearly in the resin. This isn't a hoax, Mark. This isn't something someone could fake out here." I ran my hand through my hair, fighting down rising panic. The print was fresh, the resin hadn't fully hardened. Whatever had left it had been in our camp just hours ago. Close enough to touch our supplies, close enough too. The implications turned my blood to ice. We'd been treating this like a research project, collecting data points and evidence. But this print changed everything. It was no longer about proving or disproving a theory. This was about survival. I stared at that handprint. For what felt like hours, my mind refusing to process its implications. The morning sun cast long shadows across our camp, but none of them matched the darkness growing in my gut. The print stretched nearly 16 inches from heel to fingertip, pressed deep into the wooden crate's surface. The sticky resin had preserved every ridge and whorl in disturbing detail. "We need to make a decision," Claire said, her scientific detachment cracking slightly. She'd been photographing the print from multiple angles, but her hands trembled each time she adjusted her camera. Whatever made this was here while we slept. It could have. She didn't finish the thought. Victor paced behind us, checking his rifle for the 100th time. We should set up a patrol rotation. 3 people, 8-hour shifts. Someone needs to be awake and armed at all times. And what happens when it decides to show itself? I asked, running my hand over my weathered face. That thing could tear through our tents like tissue paper. A rifle might just make it angry. The weight of my revolver at my hip felt simultaneously reassuring and useless. I'd spent 25 years flying the Alaskan bush, seen every kind of predator the wilderness could throw at us. But this was different. The precision of the print, the deliberate placement on our supplies, it spoke of intelligence. We could try to wait it out, Claire suggested, though her voice lacked conviction. The weather's supposed to clear in 3 days. If we stay quiet, keep the fires high. 3 days is a long time to play prey, Victor cut in. He'd stopped pacing, but kept glancing at the tree line. We should show strength. Make noise, mark our territory. Let it know we're not easy targets. I shook my head, remembering those wood knocks in the night, how they seemed to answer each other. Whatever's out there already knows exactly what we are. It's been watching us, testing us. This print, this is a message. The silence that followed was heavy with understanding. We were being studied, just as surely as we'd come here to study the wilderness. The irony wasn't lost on me. I've got 25 years of close calls and near misses, I said finally, checking my own sidearm. But this contract, this is my last run in the bush. If we make it out of here, I'm sticking to coastal routes and tourist trips. Claire looked at me sharply. You can't mean that. You love this work. I loved it when I understood the rules, I replied. When the dangers made sense. Bears, weather, mechanical failures, those I can handle. But this, I gestured at the handprint. This changes everything. We spent the next hour fortifying what we could, but it felt futile. Our camp was an island of false security in an ocean of ancient forest. The decision to stay armed was unanimous, though none of us voiced much faith in our weapons. We would maintain our vigil, but deep down, we all knew we were at the mercy of whatever force had chosen to make its presence known. The break in the weather came suddenly, like nature herself had decided to grant us mercy. The constant drumming of rain against canvas finally ceased, and patches of blue began appearing between the racing clouds. I immediately started my pre-flight checks, not wanting to waste a single minute of this window. Pack everything essential, I called out to Claire and Victor. Leave the rest. We need to be wheels up in 30 minutes. My voice carried more authority than I'd managed in days, the prospect of escape energizing me. They moved with practiced efficiency, though I could see the toll the past weeks had taken. Victor's hands trembled as he rolled his sleeping bag, and Claire's usual methodical approach had given way to simply stuffing equipment into whatever bag was nearest. The weight of what we'd experienced hung heavy in the silence between us. I kept my eyes on the sky, watching those clouds, praying they'd hold off just long enough. The de Havilland's floats sat ready in the river, the current gentle enough for a clean takeoff. This was it, my last bush flight in Alaska. After 23 years of flying these remote routes, I'd finally encountered something that made me question everything I thought I knew about these woods. "Ready," Claire called out, hauling her pack toward the plane. Victor followed close behind, his head swiveling to scan the tree line one last time. I couldn't blame him. That feeling of being watched hadn't diminished, even in daylight. We loaded quickly, securing everything in the cargo area. I ran through my final checks while Claire and Victor strapped themselves in. The engine turned over smoothly, thank God for small mercies, and began to warm up. The familiar vibration through the controls was reassuring, grounding me in routine and machinery rather than the unknowns that had plagued us. As we began our takeoff run, the floats cutting through the river's surface, I felt the tension in my shoulders start to ease. We lifted cleanly, the de Havilland responding perfectly as we climbed above the treetops. That's when I heard Victor's sharp intake of breath. "There!" he gasped, pressing his face against the window. "Between those spruce trees, did you see it?" I kept my focus forward, gaining altitude, but in my peripheral vision, I caught Victor's wide-eyed expression. Claire leaned across to look, but whatever Victor had spotted was already lost in the dense forest below. "It was massive," Victor said quietly, almost to himself. "Just massive. Moving between the trees like it belonged there." Neither Claire nor I responded. What could we say? We'd all experienced enough to know something had been out there, something that defied explanation. But only Victor had caught that final glimpse, and somehow, the silence that followed his words felt more appropriate than any attempt at discussion. The engine's steady drone filled the cabin as we climbed higher, leaving the research site behind. Below us, the vast Alaskan wilderness stretched out in every direction, its secrets still safely hidden beneath the endless canopy of spruce and shadow. Ranger David Knox sat across from us in his cramped office, methodically spreading our evidence. Across his desk, the morning light filtering through dusty blinds caught motes of dust as he examined Claire's photographs, lingering over the images of the bent saplings and the massive handprint we'd found on our supply crate. "And you're certain this wasn't a bear?" he asked, not for the first time. His tone remained professional, but I could see the slight furrow in his brow as he studied the cast Claire had made of the print. "Bears don't weave trees together," I said quietly. "And they don't make coordinated knocking sounds in response to human activity." I pushed my audio recorder forward, the small device containing hours of those eerie nighttime recordings. Knox picked up the recorder, turning it over in his hands. "I'll need to log all of this," he said. "File it with the other incident reports from that sector." The way he said "other" made me look up sharply, but his expression gave nothing away. Claire stepped forward, her scientific demeanor firmly back in place now that we were in civilization. "I've documented everything in detail," she said, sliding her waterproof notebook across the desk. "Times, coordinates, weather conditions, all of it." The ranger nodded, but I could see the skepticism in his eyes. Out here, official responses had to stay grounded in the explainable, the verifiable. Whatever we'd encountered out there didn't fit neatly into any of his forms or categories. Victor stood by the window, arms crossed, barely participating. He hadn't said much since we'd landed, since that final glimpse of something moving through the trees. The eager young biologist who'd started this expedition was gone, replaced by someone who jumped at shadows. "I'll process everything," Knox said finally, gathering our evidence into a manila folder. "But you should know, officially, this will likely be filed as an unverified wildlife encounter." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Though off the record, we get reports, not often, but regular enough, especially from that particular area." The unease in his voice matched what I'd been feeling since we'd escaped that place. Some truths were too big, too strange for official acknowledgement. They lived instead in the spaces between incident reports and careful, bureaucratic language. That meeting marked the end of something for each of us. I submitted my resignation to the charter company the next day. 23 years of flying. The Alaskan bush had been enough. Whatever was out there in those remote places, I'd had my fill of it. Claire threw herself back into academic work, but I heard through mutual contacts that she'd buried our findings deep in her data, marked simply as anomalous observations, unverified. Her final paper on caribou migration patterns made no mention of what we'd encountered. Victor was the most changed. He took a teaching position at a community college in Arizona, about as far from the Alaskan wilderness as he could get. Last I heard, he turned down multiple lucrative research opportunities that would have taken him back to the northern forests. As for me, I still wake sometimes hearing those rhythmic knocks echoing through the trees. The Alaskan wilderness holds its secrets close, and we were lucky to walk away with nothing worse than shaken certainties. That vast territory wasn't meant for us, not really. We were just visitors who strayed too far, pushed too deep into places that belonged to something else. Something that had been there long before us, and would remain long after we were gone. Ranger Knox kept our evidence filed away in some dusty cabinet. Another unexplained incident in a land full of mysteries. But his parting words stayed with me. The deep wilderness has its own rules, its own territories. Sometimes the smartest thing we can do is recognize where we don't belong. If this story lingered with you, subscribe. I'll return tomorrow with more.